Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski with the Cipher Brief, talking today, not for the first time, about Greenland, that big body of territory in the North Atlantic that has landed squarely in the national security conversation recently. It wasn't there, quite frankly, until President-elect Trump started talking about it, and now, as president, he has continued to talk about Greenland and its importance, in his view, for the national security of the United States, not just importance as a location, but a place that he says is an absolute necessity for the United States to gain control of for the national security of the country. Greenland is a sovereign territory of Denmark, a NATO nation, which makes this complicated. Also sends us to invite Doug Lute to our platform. Doug Lute, as most of you know, former ambassador to NATO, also a longtime career Army officer, retired as a lieutenant general. So from the military and diplomatic fronts, an ideal guest on this subject. And Doug Lute, thanks for being with us. And I thought I'd just ask a very fundamental question, because I think a lot of people aren't clear on this. What is the national security, geopolitical importance for the United States of this massive body of land that, frankly, we haven't heard about much until recent weeks and
Right.
months?
Well, it's good to be back with you and the Cipher Brief team, Tom. I think fundamentally Greenland's important because of location.
Yeah,
This is a reminder, I think, to all of us that geography still counts in a world where a lot of things span international borders, blur borders, so pandemics, cyber, information technology, and so forth. Here's a case where geography still counts, and I think it counts in a number of ways. First of all, the original sort of 50, 70-year value of Greenland had to do with its pathway. It's on the pathway. It's a stepping stone between North America and Europe,
right.
right? And coming right out of World War II, the sea lines and the airline passages to that connect those two continents was vital, especially given the recent World War II experience. So, an interesting footnote in history is that Denmark is actually one of the original 12 NATO allies, less because of Denmark's geographic position, but
Right.
because of Denmark's sovereign authority over Greenland, which is so centrally geographically important.
Yeah.
Um, in modern day terms, so where perhaps we don't rely so much on troop ships or supply ships, Liberty ships resupplying the defense of Europe, it's important for a number of reasons. First of all, it breaches the Arctic Circle, and as the northernmost passageway becomes increasingly viable as a sea line because of the retreating ice blocks. I think that Greenland's important in that way. Greenland's important because we have U.S. base. The former Thule Air Force Base in northern Greenland is important as an early warning station and as a forward operating base. And then increasingly, again, as the ice shelf recedes, um, Greenland is important because it offers the access to critical minerals,
Hmm.
which are important to the green revolution, to the green transition, but also to high tech and so forth. So, for a lot of different reasons, Greenland is geographically important.
So, as a great summary and a kind of Greenland 101 for a lot of people who need it right now, I think. So, thank you for that. Now, the issue that has put it front and center here in terms of President elect and now President Trump's statements is less about all the things you've just run through, but the fact that he is saying, and now the Secretary of State is saying as well, that U.S. control of Greenland is necessary. You mentioned the history. So I believe it's going. We're 7 decades into the existence of U.S. military facilities. The base you mentioned. Um, do you believe the term he used was U.S. control of Greenland absolute necessity? And he has also said he won't rule out the use of force to make that happen. Do you agree? Is it necessary that the U.S., given the history we have, actually control what goes on in Greenland?
Well, look, there are a lot of places around the world where American access to geographic choke points or geographic points of advantage, like Greenland, is I would argue an important, if not vital,
Hmm.
American national interest. I mean, in the same Greenland conversation, for example, If we look to the south, we talk about access to the Panama Canal.
Mm-hmm.
But access doesn't have to equate to control. And in the case of Greenland, the door is wide open for expanding American access on the security front. So Greenlanders are open, Denmark is open to expanding American military access to the island, but also on the economic front. I mean, the Greenlanders state clearly they would much prefer U.S. investment in, for example, the critical minerals field rather than Chinese investment, a key strategic competitor of ours. So we're kicking on an open door here, and this may be an instance where unfettered access, free-flowing exchange of goods, services, trade, and security arrangements is not that difficult and doesn't require anything like full-fledged American control.
Right. So it sounds like you're not in disagreement with the basic points that the administration is making, but maybe how to get there. And in terms of the points, let me just read. We have a quote from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who did just what you just did in terms of linking the Panama Canal and Greenland together. And he was talking about, as you were, Chinese influence over Greenland. He said that the Chinese could use state-linked companies to establish dual-use facilities, and then, quote, it is completely realistic to believe that the Chinese will eventually, maybe even in the short term, try to do in Greenland what they have done at the Panama Canal. So do you agree with that? And is that then an argument for, well, we have to go and take control of Greenland?
Well, I think the difference here is that there is today Chinese active investment in the two ports, the Pacific side of the canal and the Atlantic side of the Panama Canal, that may be of concern. But I think that's a degree of concern much higher than some potential hypothetical investment by the Chinese in Greenland. And furthermore, the Greenlanders and the Danes are alert to this and have stated publicly by way of bilateral security and diplomatic ties that they're wide open to increased U.S. presence and investment in Greenland. So I think they're quite distinct cases. That is between Panama and Greenland.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
You've mentioned now the Greenlanders and the Danes. We have had reports, readouts, whatever you want to call them, of a call that Mr. Trump had with the Danish prime minister. Fair to say, I think, by all accounts, didn't really go well. Some of the quotes that came out from the prime minister of Denmark: Greenland is not for sale. Counterpart in Greenland, quote, our future and fight for independence is our business. EU officials, we're not negotiating. Chancellor Scholz in Germany, borders must not be moved by force, which is a strange thing, it seems, for one NATO nation to say to another. I guess this goes to your point about kicking at an open door, because now it seems like we are at odds with NATO allies over this, correct?
Well, fundamentally, yes. I mean, look, 75, almost now 76 years ago, NATO was formed to protect the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of NATO allies, originally 12 and today 32, right? So the notion that you've got an internal NATO dispute over territory, or even the not so subtle threat of force of one NATO ally toward another is perhaps unprecedented if you set aside the Greek-Turkey relationship in the Mediterranean, right? So this is fundamentally a NATO issue. You know what I'll be watching carefully here, Tom, in the coming weeks. We're a couple weeks away from the Munich Security Conference,
right,
which is essentially the public security conference of the NATO alliance, right? I mean, NATO presence there will be very strong. In fact, the former Secretary General of NATO will soon ascend to the chair of the Munich Security Conference, Jens Stoltenberg.
right.
Just before Munich, you'll have the first defense ministers meeting of 32 defense ministers in Brussels, with Secretary of Defense Hegseth attending his first NATO session. This will come up there. It'll come up a week later in Munich. And by April, Secretary of State Rubio will be at another ministerial level meeting in Brussels. All this leads to a NATO summit in The Hague in June. So you've gotten the first 6 months of the new Trump administration, 1, 2, 3, 4 venues where this could be a disruptive topic. So it'll be interesting to watch these as sort of signposts as to whether or not we can separate the substance of this case, so the arguments for minerals, the arguments for base access and so forth, from the rhetoric. And whether or not this is a case where, as some have advised, that we should take President Trump's rhetoric seriously, but not literally, right? So is he literally talking about the use of military force? I think probably not. But these 4 events on the calendar will be real signposts in terms of this topic.
Yeah, well, you've given us 3-4 items to watch on the calendar. We'd have been watching them anyway, but thank you. And just last question, in terms of what you think, where this all may be headed at those meetings or otherwise. I mentioned we had an earlier conversation this year at the Cipher Brief, just when this was first bubbling with General Phil Breedlove about this, and he's had a lot of experience in Greenland and
Phil was SAC here when I was NATO ambassador. So
exactly,
we're longtime colleagues.
Right. So so we've got the heaviest hitters on this subject now. But he said, he said something to the effect that he wished this could have been handled with Greenland and Denmark in a more reserved way, out of the public eye, in a quiet conversation, he said, but now it's out in the open. That hasn't happened. Do you think there is a way, putting your former ambassador to NATO hat on here, to kind of lower the temperature and get it, back behind closed doors, I guess it is, as the general may have been suggesting, and deal with it that way?
Well, of course, but Phil's wishing for something which is not so. I mean, this is simply not the Trump administration's or the president himself. It's not his style. Mm-hmm. It's not his favorite move. So the notion of suddenly making a very unconventional, unpredictable president, conventional and predictable, seems to me a stretch. And I think that this is one of the features of the Trump administration that we should expect. We should buckle up, right? That this is going to be a series of unpredictable steps. And we've seen it in other venues. I mean, set aside Greenland and Panama on the foreign policy front. We've seen some domestic steps in the first weeks of the Trump administration that just demonstrate that they place a high value. The president places a value on being unpredictable and being the center of attention. So I don't think someone at his station is going to change his stripes. I mean, what we see is what we've got. And this is not going to move, in my view, back into sort of a conventional pattern of diplomatic exchange.
Where do you think it goes then? I mean, assuming, well, I won't assume anything, but how does this get resolved?
Well, I think what's viable, what's plausible, right, is that there is a conversation between the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, their Danish counterparts, their NATO colleagues, that makes much more obvious this notion of an open door, right? Mm-hmm. So there could be a change in the basing arrangement that makes clear that the door is open for increased U.S. military presence in Greenland. Of course, the door is open now, but this could be a move that gives President Trump credit for increased basing access. You can imagine some sort of economic arrangement which gives the U.S. a preferred position with regard to future investments in the critical minerals and so forth. Mm-hmm. Even though, frankly, it's not a heavy lift. I mean, the Danes and the Greenlanders are offering that today. But I would imagine that we can move this into more conventional style and conventional patterns by giving President Trump some credit for increased access, both on the security front and the economic front. Quite frankly, it may not have required the headlines or even this short video presentation to get there, but here we are, and that's a path that I'd watch carefully. I think there's some potential there.
Yeah, sounds eminently reasonable. Doug Lute, former ambassador to NATO, Cipher Brief expert. It's great to have you with us. Really
Great.
appreciate the insights. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom.